Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Our chair is a little late because of her IT problems. She's on the phone with the GSA IT right now, trying to straighten it out. But thought we could go ahead and get started and deal with some of the administrative actions while she's working on that. Welcome to the October 19th, 2023 meeting of the Federal Secure Cloud Advisory Committee, or FSCAC. My name is Michelle White, and I'm the designated federal officer for the DFO for this advisory committee. I would like to thank all of our presenters, attendees, and stakeholders for joining us today, including those who've provided public comment. Public comments submitted via the FSCAC public comment form by last Wednesday, October the 11th, 2023, have been provided to the committee members. Before we start, there are a few things you should know. This meeting is being recorded via the Zoom. As you may know, this advisory committee is statutorily required under the James N. Inhofe National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2023, and was formally established under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA, as our charter's official filing date of February 28th, 2023. This committee is considered a federal advisory committee and is governed by the requirements under FACA. My role as the GFO is to manage the day-to-day administrative operations of the committee, attend all committee meetings, and ensure that the committee meeting operates in compliance with FACA. The duties of this committee, including providing advice and recommendations to the GSA administrator, the FedRAMP board, and agencies on technical, financial, programmatic, and operational matters regarding the secure adoption of cloud computing products and services. The majority of the work of this committee will be focused around the FedRAMP Authorization Act of 2022 statutory requirements, and proposed to specifically, 1, examine the operations of FedRAMP and determine ways the authorization process can be continuously be improved. Collect information and feedback on agency compliance with and implementation of FedRAMP requirements. And 3, serve as a forum that facilitates communication and collaboration among FedRAMP stakeholder community. Lastly, I want to note that attendance has been reviewed and we do have a quorum established. I will now go through the official roll call for all council members. Please let me know if you're present by stating here. Our chair, Ann Lewis, I don't think she's joined us yet, but we'll go ahead and do the rest of the roll call. Daniel Payne.
Here.
Michael Villacerca. Ravi Jagannathan.
Yep, here.
John Greenstein.
Present.
Jim Beckner.
Here.
Marcy Womack.
Here.
Bronco Brooken.
Present.
Matt Scholl.
Here.
Bill Burles.
Present.
Lamont Yarborough.
Here.
Newman Ansari. Jackie Snoffer.
Here.
Bill Hunt.
Here.
And Joshua Cohen. As many of you will know, we do have a new member joining us this committee. I'd like to welcome Daniel Payne as FSCAC's newest representative, representing unique businesses that provides cloud computing services and products. Daniel, would you like to introduce yourself by stating your organization and telling a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, everyone. My name is Daniel Payne. I'm a senior security engineer at Databricks. I've been working in the FedRAMP ecosystem for about 8.5 years now, and I look forward to improving FedRAMP with everyone here. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Daniel. I will now just go ahead and review the agenda for everyone's awareness of the time allotments today. From 1 o'clock to 1:05, we were doing the call to order. From 1:05 to 1:10, we'll be going over the deliverable planning discussion. And that's going to be a memo structure and schedule for the delivery. At 1:10, we'll go into a deep dive briefing for the CSP authorization path, and that's provided by John Hamilton from the FedRAMP program. At 1:40 to 1:55, we will have committee Q&A, a question and answers with John Hamilton. At 1:55, we will have public comment. We are limiting that to 3 minutes per speaker. At 2:05, the committee initiative discussion on the CSP authorization improvements. And at 2:55, we'll have closing remarks. Thank you again for attending this important meeting. Just a few more housekeeping items before we start. When asking questions, please hold all questions until the end of the presentation, but please make sure to make a note of them during the presentations. At the end of the presentations, if you have a question, please raise your hand using the Zoom button in your Zoom platform, and I will call on you based on your position in the queue. I ask that members identify themselves before speaking so that those listening via webcast or reading the minutes after the meeting will know who made which comment. And also, please make sure that your microphone is muted anytime you are not speaking. To our open forum speakers today, please note a timer will be displayed on the screen indicating your time remaining, and an alert will happen when you are out of time. We are on a tight schedule today, so please be respectful of the time. To our presenters, please note that our FSCAC staff will chat you with 1 minute left. Again, when you are out of time, please make sure that you are kind of wrapping things up. There will be an open public comment period today, this afternoon, with 3 minutes allowed for each speaker. We will be interrupting and, if needed, muting speakers who exceed 3 minutes to allow for more people to speak. So please speak succinctly, and please be respectful of the time. If you're not a committee member, please hold all questions and comments until this time. Again, all public comments submitted by Wednesday, October the 11th, were presented to the committee members prior to the meeting. If you were not called on to provide public comment today and have not already done so, we welcome you to submit your comments using our form on our website, www.gsa.gov/FSCAC. We will now begin our meeting with a few words. Well, we were intending to have a few words from our chair, and I don't believe she has joined us yet. But we will go ahead and start kind of a discussion of our deliverable and the format. We are embarking on a series of focused discussions in the areas of CSP authorization process, Kanban process improvements, automation initiatives and opportunities, and we will discuss one topic per week and generate ideas and recommendations. Then on November 9th, we will vote on those recommendations to deliver to the GSA administrator. Together, we will create this list of focus areas. In our last meeting, together we created this list of focus areas in our last meeting on July 20th. Our current focus for this FSCAC meeting is the agency CSP authorization path process. This is the path that is the vast majority of the authorizations that go through for FedRAMP. Today, we're going to have a deep dive on the current agency CSP authorization path process. brainstorm potential problem statements, goals, and recommendations related to improving the authorization process. Today, we will generate topics of discussion and potential suggestions that we will later on November 9th vote on which topics and suggestions we think are most relevant. And the items that we get a majority vote on November 9th will become the recommendations that we will deliver to the GSA administrator. I'd like to start reviewing the 3 outcomes that I'd like to get from this meeting. First, I'd like to gather any feedback the committee has on the structure of the memo delivered to the administrator. If there are any questions or sections perhaps missing, etc. Go over the purpose and structure of these next 3 meetings and the timeline for delivery of this memo to the GSA administrator. And finally, generate a list of potential recommendations that we will vote on and then become part of our final recommendations for all topic areas on November 9th. We're going to display a copy of the proposed memo template on the screen. This has been publicly posted on our website. Does anyone have any questions, feedback for the memo structure? All right, I'll take that as everybody is okay with the format of the memo. Great. We're going to spend each week discussing each of the 3 topic areas that we identified earlier. In our last meeting on Thursday, November 9th, we will finalize our memo in that meeting. I would like to set the target date for delivery of to the GSA administrator as Tuesday, November 21st, in order to allow FSCAC's administrative staff time to make any final quality formatting adjustments if necessary. Does anyone have any thoughts, questions, or feedback on these actions?
Silence is concurrence, I think.
Fantastic. All right, great. Now I'd like to open the floor to John Hamilton. John is the Program Manager of Security Operations for FedRAMP and will be presenting on some additional background information on Cloud Service Provider or CSP authorization path to help us get started and give us some additional context for our discussion later this afternoon. As a reminder, please hold all questions until the end of his presentation, but make sure to make note of those questions. At the end of the presentation, you will have a question. If you have a question, please raise your hand using Zoom, and I will call on you based on the order of the queue. Again, I ask that members identify themselves before speaking, so those listening via webcast or reading the minutes later will be able to know who made that comment. And lastly, please make sure your microphone is muted anytime that you are not speaking. And with that, welcome, John.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's presentation on FedRAMP's agency authorization process. My name is John Hamilton, and my main role in the program is maintaining FedRAMP's day-to-day internal operations. This includes overseeing our program's agency authorization pipeline and review of security packages. So I have a pretty good understanding of our current process challenges and ideas on how we can improve for the future. Next slide. Today, I'll be giving you an overview of FedRAMP's current agency authorization process and how it functions, the main challenges we're facing with our operational process, and some of the ideas we have to reduce the overall timeline to get authorized. Next slide. This is the current as-is process that agencies and cloud providers go through to get their services authorized by FedRAMP. There are 3 official FedRAMP designations: FedRAMP Ready and Process and Authorized. For a cloud provider to achieve FedRAMP Ready, a Readiness Assessment Report, or RAR, must pass the PMO's review. The RAR is essentially a simplified risk assessment enabling cloud providers to demonstrate their ability to achieve a FedRAMP authorization. The RAR focuses on key capabilities rather than documentation, which enables assessors to test a cloud provider system in a shorter amount of time and gives the government a clear understanding of their technical capabilities at the very beginning of the authorization process. This also makes it easier for federal agencies to determine if a cloud provider is ready to go through FedRAMP and has a high likelihood of achieving authorization. To better understand the scope of a readiness assessment, agencies can review the FedRAMP moderate or high RAR templates. At a high level, the readiness assessment is primarily focused on the status of technical control implementations versus the status of documentation. During the readiness assessment, 3 fields validate the CSP's ability to meet specific federal mandates, like the use of FIPS 140 validated encryption and DNSSEC implementation, the CSP's ability to satisfy technical security requirements, and the CSP's maturity in areas such as change management and continuous monitoring. CSPs that achieve the FedRAMP Ready designation are listed on FedRAMP's marketplace. Agencies use the marketplace to research cloud services that meet the organizational requirements. If a CSP is interested in pursuing government clients, becoming FedRAMP Ready makes valuable information available about the service offering security for potential agency customers. Additionally, for CSPs who are considering whether or not to become FedRAMP authorized, the RAR can serve as a self-assessment to determine what gaps in the service offering security exist and where those gaps might be. Such information can help CSPs understand the level of effort necessary to secure their system according to FedRAMP requirements prior to pursuing an agency ATO. The next important designation is in process, which is a part of the pre-authorization phase. During this phase, an agency and CSP agree to partner with the common goal of achieving a FedRAMP authorization. These 2 groups then work together to prepare for and develop a plan to reach their goals. During the planning phase, the agency and CSP identify project leads and primary points of contact, and they decide how their teams will communicate, collaborate, and review the authorization package. Our office recommends establishing a recurring meeting, at least bi-weekly, to ensure the project stays on track and that everyone remains accountable for their respective areas of responsibility. Agency reviewers should have knowledge of the NIST risk management framework and experience reviewing FSMA and/or FedRAMP authorization packages. We highly recommend taking FedRAMP's ISO on training, which is designed to help agency reviewers understand the process for reviewing a FedRAMP authorization package. We also recommend agencies to consider 2 approaches to reviewing the authorization package materials, which include a just-in-time linear approach or reviewing all deliverables at the same time. The just-in-time linear approach means that once a deliverable is finalized and accepted by the agency, work begins on the next deliverable. But we've seen the most success with the just-in-time approach, since it's more iterative and agile and helps prevent rework after 3PO testing has occurred. As an agency finalizes the authorization planning phase, we then have the agency complete a work breakdown structure in partnership with the CSP. This helps establish agreed upon timelines to complete authorization responsibilities. Once the WBS is completed, the CSP submits an analysis request to the FedRAMP PMO, which indicates to our office that they're ready to begin coordinating a kickoff meeting. The purpose of the kickoff meeting is to formally begin the agency authorization process by introducing key team members, reviewing the cloud service offering, and ensuring all stakeholders are aligned on the overall process. While the FedRAMP PMO coordinates and facilitates kickoff meetings, these meetings are meant to be in service of the CSP and agency. At the conclusion of the kickoff meeting, all stakeholders should have a shared understanding of the overall process, milestones, deliverables, and schedule, the roles and responsibilities of project team members, the cloud offering's purpose and function, authorization boundary, data flows, and known security gaps, the agency's process for reviewing the authorization package and reaching a risk-based authorization decision, and lastly, FedRAMP's process for reviewing the authorization package from the perspective of government-wide reuse. Once the kickoff meeting has been completed, the CSP can begin the full security assessment of their offering. During the full security assessment phase, the 3PO performs an independent audit or test of the system against FedRAMP security baseline of controls. At the conclusion of the testing, the 3PO develops a security assessment report, which details their findings from testing and includes a recommendation for FedRAMP authorization. Based on the 3PO security assessment report findings, the CSP develops a plan of action milestones, which outlines their plan for addressing the findings from testing. The full security package is then submitted to the agency to perform a quality and risk review of the authorization package that includes the system security plan and attachments, security assessment plan, security assessment report, and POAM. The purpose of the review is to ensure that the authorization package clearly and accurately reflects the security posture of the CSO in order for the agency AO to make an informed risk-based decision. Our office recommends establishing a regular cadence of meetings that includes the agency, cloud provider, and 3PO throughout the quality and risk review in order to address agency questions and concerns in real time. This might include a longer in-person working session to address specific areas of the system. Once the agency review team finalizes the review of the authorization package and the agency AO issues an ATO for the cloud offering, the FedRAMP PMO performs a final review of the authorization package to determine suitability for government-wide reuse. The scope of the review includes a quality review to ensure the authorization package clearly and accurately represents the security and risk posture of the CSO, and a risk review to identify weaknesses and deficiencies that must be addressed. If the quality and risk posture of the cloud offering is acceptable to the FedRAMP director, the offering is designated as FedRAMP authorized and goes into continuous monitoring. Next slide. We realize that this current authorization process is in need of modernization to keep up with the high demand of packages that are submitted to our office. Currently, it takes a little over 7 months for a cloud offering to achieve FedRAMP authorization once CSP is listed as in process. And it takes just over 5 months from when the time a CSP submits their package for FedRAMP PMO review to have their package in a state where we can approve for FedRAMP authorization. Our goal is to reduce this time frame, but we're facing a number of challenges. One of the biggest challenges is around the quality of the packages submitted. The vast majority of the packages submitted to our office have issues that result in a CSP and 3PO having to clarify or retest certain controls. Some examples of common issues that we include lack of encryption, use of unauthorized external services to store and process federal data, poorly documented authorization boundaries, complete and unclear control implementations, and inconsistencies between documented control implementations and assessment results. We're also experiencing higher levels of package submissions than in previous years, in particular for high impact systems, which require more scrutiny and time to review by our team. In FY22, we had 47 package submissions, 2 of which were high impact packages. And in FY23, we had 58 packages in total, 16 were high packages. We've attempted to address this problem by adding additional reviewers to support the larger number of packages in our queue. We really haven't seen an overall reduction in the authorization timeline. And lastly, we want to better understand how long each of these steps in the agency authorization process is taking, not just the time for our office to review and approve packages. To achieve this once we fully transition to a CRM tool and have the capability to collect this data for each cloud provider that's engaged with our program. Next slide. To give you a better idea of FedRAMP's agency authorization timeline, we did an analysis of packages submitted to the FedRAMP PMO in FY22 and 23. At the time of the analysis, this number was 105 packages. During this time, it took our team an average of 54.5 days to begin a review of a package that was submitted and placed in our queue. As I mentioned earlier, this time duration is largely a result of the higher number of packages in our queue, the greater number of high impact packages submitted, and the quality issues associated with the packages submitted, which in our team have to document more findings in their assessment reports and get clarifications from stakeholders. Of these 105 packages submitted, our office was able to authorize 79. These packages took our team on average 22 days to complete their review. But all of these packages required rework and had significant quality issues, which is why it took our team 22 days to complete. Typically, a package free of major quality issues takes our team on average 6 days to complete. And for each of these 79 packages, It took the CSP and 3PO an average of 84.5 days to complete their remediation actions. These are the actions that our office has requested the CSP and 3PO to complete in order for us to clearly understand the risk posture of the offering so we can make an authorization decision. So from the time of package submission to FedRAMP authorization, it took an average of 5.37 months. But if the packages were free of significant quality issues, and only took our team one cycle to review, this number could be an average of 6 days, a 96% reduction in time, which is huge. Next slide. Reducing the time to authorization is a top priority for our program. And we've already identified a number of opportunities to make the process more efficient. Some initial ideas we're exploring include a fast-tracked authorization if a cloud offering has already achieved FedRAMP ready status. These packages will be prioritized for review since their key security capabilities have already been assessed by our team and should not take as much time to review. We're also looking into having an outside process expert from the Centers of Excellence assess the review queue and provide recommendations to more efficiently structure our team to process reviews faster. And we want to relook at how we're assessing security packages and see if there are any controls that may not be as critical to review to make an authorization decision. Next, we want to introduce new ways for CSPs to get FedRAMP authorized. We're thinking of potentially using trusted agency partners to do the heavy lifting for package reviews. We would provide a standardized list of requirements that must be a part of all authorization packages that the agency partner would then need to validate. Once validated by the agency, the package would be submitted to the FedRAMP PMO to do a less time-intensive quality spot check. Another idea includes giving agencies the option to partner with other agencies to collaboratively issue an authorization. This would make the authorization process less time-consuming for a single agency if the roles and responsibilities for reviewing package materials were divided amongst teams. It could also help agency teams unfamiliar with the process get up to speed faster when partnered with an agency that's already gone through the FedRAMP process. And lastly, we want to automate our authorization documentation using OSCAL-enabled tools. Our office has already developed a systems architecture plan that specifies the requirements for OSCAL-enabled tools, which standardizes documentation submissions and continuous monitoring for all stakeholders. And we're currently working with the GSA TTS Office of Acquisitions to complete the selection process for an OSCAL-enabled solution. Next slide. So that concludes the brief portion. Are there any questions about the topics that I covered?
All right, thanks, John. I definitely appreciate that. And we will get to the questions. I will now begin calling on members of FSCAC that have identified that they have questions. Members, please raise your hand if you have a question, and I will call on you to unmute yourself based on the order in which you raised your hands. Please keep in mind this is a Q&A portion of our agenda, and discussion should be reserved for the discussion item later in the agenda. Lastly, please remember to restate your name prior to speaking. All right, first up, we have John.
Thank you, and thank you for that presentation. This is John Greenstein with Bluescape. We're a small business software company that recently went through this process. I have two questions, I guess. I'll ask the first one first, which is I really want to hear more about that. Some of the package submission issues are significant, and if you could just, I know you talked about some of the reasons what you thought were significant issues, but could you expand on that? It just seems like it's having just gone through this process with our company.
Sure.
We had issues, but nothing was significant. It almost seems like unconscionable that people, with all the documentation you guys put out, because I think you do put out some pretty good documentation, that there
like we try to do our best.
Issues.
Exactly. We try to do our best to train, our cloud providers, our 3PAOs, document, what we're looking for. We have kickoff meetings with our stakeholder groups before they go into the security testing phase. And we lay down our expectations for what we want to see in a package. But to answer your question more specifically, so some of the key, issues that we typically see in a package are actually pretty numerous. But to name a few, we see the POAM misspecifies vendor dependencies versus operation requirements versus false positives. That's one. The package is often missing raw scan files that are, necessary to understand the cloud services inventory. The POAM does not specify all SAR risk exposure table findings is another example. There's often inconsistency between control implementation summary, spreadsheet and SSP controls. And we often see DNSSEC is inaccurately described in controls and is missing from the network diagram. So these are just, some of, several, many, but those are kind of the key ones that we often see. In addition to the authorization boundary diagram not being clear in a lot of cases or understandable. In a lot of cases, we see that the boundary diagram doesn't accurately reflect what's the narrative describing what the boundary is. And we often don't see encryption throughout the authorization boundary where it's required. Often it's not depicted in the authorization boundary or network boundary diagrams. And these are key pieces of information that we need to make authorization decisions. So yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that we're trying to educate better and make cloud providers and 3POs better aware of what we're looking for. But we still continue to have these quality issues come through our office when we're doing reviews.
And so I guess the follow-on question there is like, is there any, because some of the things you mentioned, I guess, look, it might be difficult to create the proper boundary diagram. I can see that that's a challenge, and we had challenges with things like that. But the basic things like missing raw scan files or the POAM with vendor dependencies or some of the encryption items that you just mentioned seem almost unforgivable. And I don't know if you have do you I'm not going to put you on the spot because I'm putting you on the spot. Do you think vendors are just rushing to get into the queue, or do you think they really just don't have the understanding of what it is you're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of, yeah, potentially, there may be a big rush to get a package, submitted to our office to get reviewed before, a certain time frame. That's definitely, I think, a piece of the issue here. And I do think it's also an education issue. I think that even agency review teams are not familiar what the security package contains completely and what they should be really looking for in the reviews before it even comes to the PMO to do a final review for government-wide reuse. But we do have some solutions potentially that could resolve these issues. In addition to training, documentation updates, we really want to use an OSCAL-enabled tool at some point to do self-validations or self-checks of packages. So this could be done by the 3PO and the cloud provider, and even the agency if they have the tool available, to do a self-validation of packages that looks at key pieces of the security package before it even comes to our office to do a review. So basically, we would need confirmation from this tool that these checks have been done, all these checks have been successfully validated, and then we would do our final review or spot check, which would hopefully be a lot less amount of time for us to do to reach an authorization decision. So that's our guess our next iteration or next phase of the program. That's our goal, to get into more of an automated way to review packages that's more suited for our stakeholders and also for our office when we're doing reviews.
All right, thanks, John. Let's go to Bo next for his question.
Hey, thanks, Michelle, and thanks for the presentation, John.
Sure.
Quick question. The process that you described, this is specifically the intake for already agency authorized FedRAMP solutions for getting inputted into the FedRAMP marketplace. I just want to make sure I understand the context.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, so basically this is the time it takes from the time we do a kickoff with all of our stakeholders to the time that we do our review and are able to finally authorize a cloud service.
Okay, so in other words, GSA, for example, internally reviews and issues a FedRAMP authorization for vendor X. And then we effectively submit that overall package into the FedRAMP PMO. And from there, it takes another 7.32 months to get them registered into the FedRAMP marketplace on a typical basis, you're saying?
So basically, to break that down a little more, so once we get a package for review, so this is the time that's, when a cloud provider submits their full security package for the PMO to do a review.
Mm-hmm.
And when we are able to finally authorize the package, we're saying it takes about 3 months essentially to do that review and get to an authorization decision on average.
Got it. So at this point, these vendors have already been working for months, if not year plus in some cases, with an agency sponsor, and then they're essentially coming in again and facing about another 5+ month process to effectively get posted into the FedRAMP process.
Yeah, there's part of the timeline that we're not capturing, which includes the cloud service actually being stood up, right? So it takes a lot of time for the cloud provider to actually stand up their offering, so it's mature enough to even go through a FedRAMP authorization. So that piece, that planning and development piece, is not captured here.
Got it. Is one suggestion here or thought? Does FedRAMP currently require or kind of a qualitative review sheet from CSPs that accompanying their underlying FedRAMP package that essentially goes through and asks and answers a basic set of prerequisite or qualification questions before they actually submit their packages?
Yeah, so this is primarily done during the kickoff meeting. So we have all stakeholder groups put together a work breakdown structure of what the expectations are and timelines for getting certain milestones done for their authorization package. So we do ask for that during the kickoff.
Okay, so even though you set some of the base expectations, particularly around some of the challenges that you mentioned are common examples that you have issues with as part of the packages reviewed, that they're still coming through with issues.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, so we cover a lot of the common issue areas we see in packages during the kickoff meeting. So this is the meeting that happens before a vendor actually does the full security assessment for their offering.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. I will note to the FSCAC members, there's a typo on this slide that says it goes to 140. It's actually going to 155. And I think that some people took down their hand. If you'd like to ask some more questions, please go ahead and raise your hand again. All right, we'll go to Ravi next.
Hey, Ravi.
Yes, hi, Ravi Jagannathan from Palo Alto Networks. Hi, John. So one of the things that I was thinking was, it may be beneficial to provide or publish some kind of a training from the FedRAMP PMO, side on how people need to prepare. So the common issues that you mentioned are by and large, pretty basic from the view
Right.
of a person who knows everything, right? But oftentimes, when people don't know about certification, which is like 95% of, the IT community, which is in commercial, right? And for them, if you can publish an hour or two of training and make it mandatory before they can submit the package, I thought that could go a long way, because then you can say, hey, these are the checklists that you need to do. Before that, you cannot submit. And if there is a way, like a couple of, members of each and every, CSP take
Right.
the training and they register saying that, yes, I have taken the training, here is the completion certificate. That gives you some sort of, information that they have at least listened to, what you have to say, right?
No, that's a great idea, great thoughts. We do have CSP on-demand training that we do offer that kind of covers a lot of these areas in our process and how to submit packages so it can actually be successfully reviewed by our office. But maybe it's not detailed enough. Maybe it's something that we need to look at a little bit more to see if there's areas that we can provide further guidance and even more detail. So we do see more consistency in what we do receive. I do like the idea of making it mandatory, but we also need to get to a point where, is this training effective? Like, is this the information that our stakeholders need in order to do a package successfully with our office? Like, that's something that we need to relook at and see if there's, better information that we can provide in this training to get to the desired level that we're looking for.
Right.
Another idea that we had was potentially having attestations, checked off. So basically having, the agency review team, the cloud provider, the 3PAO, basically attest to checking off certain areas of the package that we look at on our ends before it even comes to our office to do a review. So that there's some more accountability, I should say, before we even do a review on our end. So these are some ideas that we have considered. They are good ideas, and I think that's something that we may want to actually implement, to help reduce these quality issues that we're seeing.
Exactly. See, the number of packages that are going to come in is only going to increase, right? It's not going to decrease. I mean, at least that's what I'm imagining.
Yeah, we're
right?
seeing a huge increase in demand over the past, two fiscal years.
Yeah, and I think it is going to increase more in the coming years before it gets stabilized, right? So I think even this particular training I'm talking about, it can even span, about a day, because you may have multiple modules and you want people to take it. And once you make it mandatory, the downside of this is you may have to update your training more frequently than, what is being done right now. But and then, that may be the downside, but I think, that will give you, some sort of, gating point that people have invested their time in trying to understand this before they submit the package, right? So that's one thought. And the second thought that came to my mind was when you said we receive packages that are, grossly incomplete with basics. I questioned the 3PAO involved in assessment then, because when you go through an assessment with the 3PAO, they actually, go through your SSP. They go through, a lot of the, data flow diagrams, boundary diagrams. They check the FIPS certificate. They do all of that. Even after that, you are receiving incomplete package means, to me, what it is telling me is the some of the packages you are getting from 3PAO are not of quality. Is there a way that PMO can interact with the 3PAO or to improve the package that hits you, right? That's another.
Yeah, I mean, we've been trying to address this issue too with our 3PO community. I actually oversee our 3PO program for FedRAMP, and this has been one of the long challenges that we've had since I've began with FedRAMP. This inconsistent quality that we receive from some of the assessments that we get. We tried to ramp up training requirements for our 3POs, requiring certain certifications for 3POs to have before they can even do a FedRAMP assessment. We started doing testing requirements through the Baltimore Cyber Range, so having teams go through the cyber range and do a basic assessment like FedRAMP before even going through the FedRAMP process, making that a requirement. Requiring them to take our FedRAMP training modules, require them to have an internal training program that they have to maintain related to specific topic areas that are important to do assessments for FedRAMP. But still, we're just not seeing, the desired outcome, I should say.
I actually think you won't. And here's the reason why. The other thought that came to my mind was because, a lot of people who are outside, I meet a lot of people who are not familiar with certification processes, right?
Yeah.
And I think, I see your difficulty, and And I find it, and I'm beginning to think you are not going to see an improvement. Another thing that thought that came to my mind is open office. Is there a way on a designated dates? You know, it doesn't have to be every day of the month, like 1 or 2 days of every month. You can have open office, well-published open office that vendors can come and talk to you about various things. And I think, you know, you have a lot more, you know, various communication with 3PAO, but
Yeah.
the people's communication with vendors is very scarce, if any, right? And I think some kind of an open office, you know, even once or twice a month, that'll go a very long way.
Thanks, Ravi. We probably need to move on to some of our other questions before we run out of time. Bill, can we go to you
Thanks,
now?
Rob. We did capture that idea. Thank you, though.
Hi, yes, Bill Hunt, Securities Exchange Commission. Thanks, John, for the presentation. I think you covered a lot of the questions I had in addressing other John's questions at the start. I just had a quick clarification. When you were talking about the quality issues before, are those quality issues mainly with the initial submissions, or I also saw that there was that long delay in remediation? Were the things that you were discussing also part of the remediation, or is the remediation concerns completely different?
Yeah, so these are related to actually both, but just specifically, I was talking to the initial assessments. So I had our team do an analysis for me before this presentation, and I asked them, you know, for all this past FY 23, were we able to review a package the first time and get to authorization? And the answer to that was no. So all of the packages I received last year, we had to do a remediation with the vendors. There's remediation actions required to get to authorization. So there was a package that we were able to review once and get to good, unfortunately.
Sure. Okay. And so briefly, can you characterize the nature of the things that are needing to be remediated that are different than the things that you described previously in answering John's questions, or just trying to understand what's slowing folks down on the other end, you know?
Yeah, we're seeing inadequate boundary protection being documented and tested, you know, digital identity gaps in the package, lack of encryption, like I mentioned, use of non-authorized external services, and also inadequate, you know, 3PO testing, like we were talking before. So we're just not able to understand the full story of a cloud provider's security posture is the bottom line, because things just aren't adding up. We're not seeing consistencies in the areas of the package where it should be. So, I mean, that's really, you know, the bottom line of, you know, why we have to do all these multiple passback. We just don't understand the full security posture of these offerings, or how, you know, cloud service providers, you know, basically are implementing certain controls, and how 3POs have tested those controls as being satisfied.
Great. Thanks, John. That's really, really helpful. I appreciate it.
Sure.
All right, great. Let's go to Matthew next.
Is that me?
Matthew Schull?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Good to go. John, thank you. I'm sorry, this is Matthew Scholl from NIST. And John, I also run the crypto algorithm validation program, the crypto module validation program, and the PIV test and acceptance program. So I feel you. I understand what you're doing. I get it.
If I sound a little frustrated, I apologize, but it is a big problem for us. And
it is a big problem. I'm with you.
Dude,
I have very similar issues. All right. So a lot of it comes down to money. So I want to ask about your funding sources. Are you allowed to charge for services? Things are flattening or getting smaller, and yet you're going to be asked to do more and ramp up. So one of my concerns, and one of the things as a board member that I want to be sure, at least as in any recommendation, is that we call and we ask for adequate resources to cover at least any recommendation, or at least to cover needed improvements. So are you just kind of base funding, or are you allowed a chargeback model?
So the funding questions I will leave to our core. I'm probably not the best person to talk to about that.
very
But
diplomatic.
I will say that in terms of our review team, we have ramped up the number of reviewers to do reviews this year. So initially, we had 4 reviewers in total doing all these package reviews for FedRAMP. We've expanded that quite a bit this year due to increased funding that we received from the program. So now we're up to about 12 reviewers. So we've increased that team by threefold. But even with that increase in resources, we're still having issues with the timelines to get authorized.
Yeah, and I'm with you, John. And this is, as you grow exponentially, this is not something you're going to be able to hire your way out of. I think you're right by taking the multi-prong approach of standardization and automation of submission, which allows for automation, some automation of review, standardization of test expectation,
right,
and then which leads to standardization of what a test report should look like. A couple of things we did to try to help with this is we put out a quarterly, we call it a lab bulletin, which for us is just to the test labs, where we say, this is what we've seen. These are common questions we've gotten. We're going to answer that as a quarterly FAQ back out so that everyone sees this. And then we also hold an annual workshop conference, multi-day. The testers, the customers, and industry all come together, and we talk as a community about issues, challenges, and we share frustrations together. We do that annually. For us, it's called the ICMC.
So basically an industry day to get all the stakeholder groups together and talk about common, I guess, topics of concern or of interest.
Yeah. And for us, that's called the International Crypto Module Conference, the ICMC, but it's another idea. The other thing that we see sometimes, and you were kind of highlighting this, again, I'm coming back to money because it's always about money, is submitters, 3PAOs, and even some providers will sometimes find it cheaper for us to do the QA on their submission packages than to have them do it. So they sometimes are willing to allow for the time and allow us to do the turn because it's easier and cheaper for them to get the packages right than to have them do it right themselves. We sometimes will levy what we call points or demerits against a lab or a tester over time. Sometimes we even publish that or suspend certain 3PAOs or testers if their quality over time doesn't meet a preset, already announced, this is the minimum bar of compliance. So I don't know if you have that capacity or not, but those are some of the things that we've had to put in place.
We do have thank you for that. We do have a 3PO performance management process that basically goes through 3 phases. So there's a consultation phase for less significant issues, but they could, rise to significance if they continue to operate in a certain fashion, or continue, doing certain types of assessment work and their repeat issues. So there's a consultation phase where we just have, a one-on-one meeting with 3POs to go over some issues that we're seeing in their assessment work. And if we see repeat issues based on that consultation, it escalates to a intermediation status, which is more significant. And we basically ask the 3PO to develop a remediation plan that we have to accept in order for them to get off of intermediation. If we continue to see issues that are of significance after intermediation, that's when we potentially revoke 3PAOs from the program.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John. We are running out of time, so I'm going to go to one final question from Jackie.
Hi, Jackie.
Hey, how are you doing? John, just a really quick question. I know that y'all are waiting on your GRC to implement OSCAL. Is there a way that we can back the process up and start working pilots for those of us that already have GRC tools so that when you hit the ground with your GRC, we're ready to go so that we can start testing the products and figure out what works and what doesn't and how we get our automation in line? Over.
Yeah, we're actually planning for that. It's a good question. We're trying to set up an early adopters, workshop. So for those who are, ready to hit the ground running, we're going to go over basically, how to use the tool, how to use it against our requirements for automation. So that's something that's upcoming in the next, I believe, next fiscal year. You should be seeing some information from our program about that.
Next fiscal year, that would be a year from now.
Oh, this fiscal year, I'm sorry. We just hit FY24. So I would say the
Yeah.
next calendar year. That's what I meant.
Okay. And my other question was, is it really necessary? I heard you say that the RAR has to be done by a 3PAO. Is it possible just we have so many barriers to entry to small business to reduce the cost to let the RAR be done by the cloud service provider assessing his own capabilities? Over.
Yeah, to answer that question, so for JAB PATOs, 3PO, FedRAMP recognized 3PO is required, but for the agency authorization path, it's not required. So agencies have the ability or choice to use their internal, assessments entity, or they can choose someone outside of the FedRAMP recognized, program to do an assessment for their service offering. So there's that ability.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, thank you all for this discussion, and thank you, John, for your informative presentation and providing more context around the CSP authorization path. We are now at the point in the agenda where we would like to welcome the public to unmute themselves and share their comments. To our speakers, again, please note a timer will be displayed on the screen to indicate that your time remaining. An alert will indicate that you are out of time. We are on a tight schedule today, so please be respectful of the time. Each speaker is allotted 3 minutes to make their comments. We will be interrupting and, if needed, muting speakers who exceed 3 minutes to allow for more people to speak. So please speak succinctly and please be respectful of the time. As a reminder, all public comments submitted by Wednesday, October the 11th, were presented to committee members prior to this meeting. Now, please raise your hand if you wish to provide comment, and I will call on you to unmute yourself in the order in which your hand was raised. I will now invite people one at a time to speak. Do we have any public commenters? Okay, apparently we do not have any public commenters for this FSCAC, so this concludes our public comment section for today. Thank you all for joining us and for your comments that you submitted prior to today's meeting. Now, I would now like to invite the committee to join a discussion to determine what improvements to the CSP authorization process they would like to propose in the final deliverable to the GSA administrator. For this session, we will be live capturing your comments as notes on the screen in a draft deliverable for our future meeting. Please review your comments as captured, and should anything be mistyped or stated, please feel free to correct the capturer immediately to avoid misunderstanding by raising your hand and noting that correction. As the committee chair, Anne would typically invite you to start with your thoughts and lead the committee instruction, but she is still having some technical issues, so I will be leading or facilitating the discussion today. And then I will also be providing insight to the process for scheduling the meetings and any FACA roles and basically supporting the discussion. We are going to be going over 3 areas: a problem statement, our goals, considerations, and recommendations. So we do want to level set. We want to focus on ideas for program level improvements for improving authorization timelines throughout and throughput. Where are the bottlenecks? How do we know how well the process is working? And how well can that process scale? How do we know what success looks like? What are we measuring? What should we measure? What data should FedRAMP make more transparent? Think about how we can come up with the process improvements that affect all CSPs, such as reducing barrier to entry for small businesses. Also take into consideration specific sectors that have needs that are not currently accounted for. Don't worry about wordsmithing today. We have support staff that are knowledge capturing our draft deliverable for us. And we will notify you when we have 1 minute left. So we will make sure that we do this in a timely, organized fashion. Let's open up the floor to discussing the problem statement. What problems should we solve? We've got 10 minutes to discuss this. Does anybody have a suggestion for developing our problem statement for CSP authorizations? And Bronco, you're the first to raise your hand, so please provide your suggestion.
Thank you. This is Branko Boca, and actually, I don't have a suggestion. I have a question, a point of clarification. We're talking about CSP authorization process, and the focus of John's presentation, which was super helpful, and thank you, John, was really on the FedRAMP authorization process. Although there are other steps in the process, clearly the agency authorization part, and then what happens when another agency wants to reuse that authorization, there's yet another piece of authorization. So my question is, what is the scope of our problem statement and our recommendation? Is it just the FedRAMP authorization piece, or are we looking at the entire life cycle?
This is Jackie's thought. If we're discussing, I think it really needs to be the full life cycle, because a lot of this, so much of the authorizations are done by agencies, and the FedRAMP PMO is involved in those as well. So if you asked me in developing the problem statement, I think it ought to be inclusive of the whole.
This is Bo. I echo Jackie's statement as well. I mean, the problem, is multi-part, both front-ended, back-ended, and the presentation from John today is really specifically focused on just a narrow component of that, right? Is, we're essentially getting already agency authorized packages that are then taking roughly 6 months to actually be posted onto the FedRAMP marketplace. That's a unique problem in one part of a larger challenge. And I think going through and looking at the full assembly line is fundamental.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I thought we were having multiple meetings to discuss the various pieces of the process. I thought today's was supposed to be just focused on this one area.
Yes, that is correct. We have the three items that we identified to focus on first, and today we are focusing on the CSP authorization improvements. We also have the comment process that we will have next week, and then the I think automation initiatives is the third area.
So it sounds like we should focus on just the area that was presented then.
But I think that this point of discussion and clarification is, do we focus on the PMO authorization process for FedRAMP FedRAMP authorization post agency authorization, or are we including agency authorization in this process? Is that what I'm understanding from Bronco and Jackie?
Marcy, I agree with you. Yeah.
And to be honest, it is hard to start with the discussion of this single piece without really understanding the full process and all the steps that are involved.
Okay, great. It seems to me that there are enough people who are interested in looking at the full aspect of the authorization lifecycle. So let's focus our problem statement around that. Bo, you have your hand up. Do you have a suggestion for our problem statement?
Yeah, I just want to go through and respond to Bill, just to make sure that, we do have 3 more sessions: Kanban, automation, and finalization of deliverables. And the suggestion here is that, the presentation that John made is one part of the CSP authorization process. It's not the whole of the CSP authorization process, just for my colleagues on the board.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you for the clarification.
All right, great. Bo, did you have a suggestion for the problem statement?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, if we're focusing around the whole of it, you know, part of this, particularly in this case, the agency authorization process, you know, I think the challenge here is that fundamentally, the FedRAMP PMO is not getting quality FedRAMP authorization packages that are consistent with FedRAMP requirements. Hence, the delays in authorization process to getting vendors that have already gone through this with an agency sponsor being reflected in the FedRAMP marketplace. So I believe that there's fundamental quality challenges and expectation challenges that are being missed throughout. That includes the FedRAMP sponsoring agency. Because fundamentally speaking, if the FedRAMP sponsoring agency, actively worked and collaborated with the CSP, some of the same findings should not be coming back up with the FedRAMP PMO. And it just simply means that, there's a gap in terms of what the quality level is with the sponsoring agency versus what the expectation is with the FedRAMP PMO.
Okay, thanks, Bo. Jackie, do you have any suggestions for the problem statement?
I was working trying to capture what people have said. It's really improving the speed of time to marketplace through improvements in the quality of the body of evidence, automation, and something. I just hadn't quite gotten there. Training or standardization, but it really is that overall improvement of speed to marketplace. And that encompasses both the FedRAMP and the agency processes. So it is to the quality of the body of evidence, improvements in automation, and training.
All right, thanks, Jackie. Mike.
Yep. So Mike from Google, representing large CSPs and CSPs in general. I think one of the things that I'd like to kind of pivot a little bit on the problem statement is that specifically for the authorization process, like we're not set up for the scale of business and industry with this process. I think we have a exponential growth in services that are available through cloud providers, and we have a sublinear. I think looking at the number of authorizations we have so far, there's around 320 in the database today, and we're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of services, hundreds to thousands of services that are out there in the marketplace. So I think we need to really focus on how do we scale, how do we automate, how do we do this in a way that doesn't require additional engineers, people. To be the resource for scaling, and how can we scale this in a way that provides mechanisms within this process? I think OSCAL is a good start, but how do we continue to drive that so that we can make sure that we are delivering services that are fully compliant with all regulations, and you have good monitoring and continuous monitoring on that from this authorization process through the rest of the life cycle. So those are all from the authorization perspective, like how can we automate as much of this as possible so that there's no humans in the loop, or we reduce the need for humans in the loop? Are there technologies we could potentially leverage at different stages and phases of the authorization process to do that? And then the other thing I wanted to touch on, which is slightly different from these perspectives so far, but is there a need for us to have a exception to this process, where things that are requested by the government or needed by, needed now, and I'll use AI as an example, right? Are there going to be areas where we want to be able to do pilots initiatives where we need to roll out services in a much faster way, where we could do some kind of risk analysis against them, so that we could get them out the door faster and potentially in limited scope. And I know we have like agency ways of doing that, but is there a maybe FedRAMP way of doing that in the future that would allow us to have, at least for target services, target CSP initiatives, a way to respond to those in a way that doesn't take 7+ months?
Thanks, Mike. Bill.
Yeah, I just wanted to concur and maybe distill down a little bit with what most of my colleagues have already said here. I think that we are generally in agreement that the main reason that we're meeting is because, time to marketplace continues to be problematic for us, but time is specifically a product of the quality of what's being delivered at the end of the day. So it's the symptom, and the cause here is clearly that the quality is not at the level that is necessary to be successful and fast here. And then to maybe rephrase what was just stated a little bit, it's still largely a manual process at the end of the day. If mainly this is people filling out paperwork, this is definitely not scalable. I do want to voice my concern over this body taking on the notion of an exception process to FedRAMP when we're here to be talking about how to improve the FedRAMP process. There's already a documented exception process that is agency by agency and a CIO by CIO risk acceptance. I have serious qualms about the federal government having a government-wide exception process that takes the control out of the hands of the CIOs.
Thanks, Bill. Let's go to Marcy next.
Thank you. I want to focus slightly on the quality concern. So identifying the root cause of why there may be quality concerns, specifically that from a slightly defensive position, 3PAOs don't seek to do a poor job and not meet quality standards, and neither do CSPs, right? So really ensuring that FedRAMP, that the expectations of the program for quality of deliverables, the standards that we're meeting with the documentation, the testing, even the expectations for authorization boundary diagrams, to ensure that that is all updated with speed and I guess with the changing of interpretation of controls, and ensuring that all the documentation is in sync, because that is a very, very clear concern as of current.
Thank you, Marcy. Robbie.
Yeah, the one of the problem statement that comes to my mind is it possible to have minimum set of mandatory trainings for the CSPs so they can do a better job of producing the packages? And so that's what I had. That's a suggestion I had.
All right, thanks, Ravi. And Daniel.
Hi, yes, Daniel Payne from Databricks. I agree with everything that's been said, and I think one of the other complaints that I hear frequently is finding a sponsoring agency is incredibly difficult, and then finding a sponsor that knows the ins and outs of FedRAMP and can actually assist in getting you to authorization faster is even more difficult. So maybe piggyback on the training and other aspects. I'd like to kind of see something done around this aiding sponsors or getting FedRAMP Sherpas or something like that to agencies that want to sponsor but maybe don't have that expertise yet.
All right, thanks, Daniel. We are going to move on to the goals. So with goals, anyone have suggestions for what our goals should look like? Ravi, go ahead. Ravi, do you have any suggestions for the goals?
Oh, yeah, I was talking with my mute on. The overall reduction of the time it takes to get authorized. Reduction of the overall time it takes to get authorized. That should be one of the ultimate goal. We should have that overarching goal.
Okay, great. Perfect. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, I'll come back to my ensuring the program is adequately resourced to achieve its mission. And because I'm NIST, I have to talk metrics. When we talk about time, I think a goal might also be to, getting an authorization is painful. Nobody likes it, and they all take time. But I'm not sure if we have a good baseline understanding of what time generally is for an authorization. So if there's a way to do a set of comparative metrology against authorization packages being conducted in agencies to see where this process compares in timeline, rather than just saying make it shorter. It might be interesting to have metrics on what is the general timelines and then where the program sits in comparison.
Great, thanks, Matt. Bo, do you have any suggestions on what our goals should look like?
Yeah, I do. Just 2, 3, and I did have one thing for the problem scope. I think if I may just go back 1 second. I think one of the fundamental challenges that I heard from that last discussion was really related to, accountability, and to both at the 3POW level, at the vendor level, as well as with the sponsoring agency. I think going back through and ensuring that there's a means to be able to hold accountable parties that are fundamentally submitting packages to the FedRAMP PMO that are attesting to be formally conformant to the FedRAMP requirements. I think there is a gap there. Somebody had mentioned an attestation of sorts. That should essentially be fundamentally factored into that. As for goals, agree with everything there. One thing is, I think a goal really needs to be a rescoping of what actually requires FedRAMP. I think that question needs to be asked and answered. Just because you're operating in the cloud, that doesn't mean you effectively have to go through and provide achieve a FedRAMP authorization. And there is a misnomer today in that anything cloud requires FedRAMP. And I think that is a challenge that really needs to be reviewed and revisited just to ensure that we're aligned properly.
That's a great point.
And then one last point is, really a look at other type assessment models. I know we have, FedRAMP high, FedRAMP moderate, FedRAMP low, FedRAMP tailored, but particularly for lower risk cloud SaaS type services, the leaning and leveraging, and really more so leveraging third-party assessments that are already being conducted that do provide confidence and used actively across the commercial community, I think is really important, particularly around ISO, PCI, SAS, SOC 1, 2, et cetera, just to be able to see whether any of those can potentially go through and be integrated with or be used in lieu of for lower risk SaaS type solutions.
Right, great, thanks, Bo. Let's go to Bill next.
Hi, Bill Hunt, SEC. Just to be overly pedantic here, making sure that we're capturing under the goals that, again, we're still talking about like the timeliness of it, and the goal should be the quality is high, right? That the initial submissions are of such a quality that it reduces the time because there isn't a lot of back and forth that needs to be done. So I think that it really should come down to the initial submission. The first things that people are putting into those packages should be comprehensive, complete, and have all of the information the team needs to make that assessment. And I think that leads to some very natural synergies with how we get there from an education and a tooling perspective. So again, high quality initial submissions, I think that gets us the timeliness we're talking about.
All right, great. Let's go to Joshua next. Joshua, do you have any recommendations for our goals?
Sorry, I'm talking on mute. My apologies. I wanted to first say that I agree strongly with the rescope what actually requires a FedRAMP. I hadn't thought of that, but I've firsthand seen that cause a lot of confusion. But the thing I was going to mention was we've talked, I think we just talked a few times with previous speakers around kind of the quality Are there, and I didn't hear in the presentation that came, like, is anybody tracking the details of those quality issues? So establishing some kind of way to say, not only are there just issues that we want generally for those issues to be handled, but that we would track the issues and the responsible parties for those issues, you know, in an ongoing fashion. So we actually have data to kind of circle back with some of those stakeholders to make sure, you know, those improvements happen and accountability is clear, and it doesn't look like everybody's pointing fingers at each other. That's all. Thank you. And this is Josh Cohen from the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Thanks, Josh. Let's go to John next.
Thanks. So yeah, I want to actually just echo something that I think Bo was talking about earlier in terms of the accountability. I just it's why I asked that question when the presentation was given. Like, there's a lot of information out there. I feel like if a vendor CSP doesn't take advantage of all the resources that are already available, we need obviously to provide them more resources. But at the end of the day, there has to be some sort of accountability and an attestation. I'm not a big fan, to be honest, of mandatory training or mandatory anything. Look, honest mistakes happen, but and yes, we should provide better information to CSPs, but at the end of the day, the vendor needs to be accountable. And someone else mentioned some sort of like demerits if people really submit sloppy information to FedRAMP PMO, and that's dragging their timelines out. That's yeah, I think that's on the CSP. Anyway, in terms of goals, I would just want to add, so we talked about moving the process faster, and we talked about higher quality submissions. I'm all for those two things. But again, as the small business here on this council, reducing the cost has also got to be it's just, and maybe the two things go together, but I don't want to accelerate any process unless we're also reducing the cost on the CSP to submit.
All right, thanks, John. And let's go to Marcy next.
Thank you. As it relates to kind of the accountability discussion, ensuring that we identify the parties who are accountable. Again, root cause, FedRAMP defines the FedRAMP requirements. PMO is responsible for that. So if there are quality issues and consistent things that are showstoppers to authorization, maybe there should be some sort of metric or process to reevaluate how that requirement or how that issue is communicated to the community at whole.
Thanks so much, Marcy. And Jackie.
To me, I was thinking that some of this may just be the complexity. And I think it would be good almost to evaluate the complexity of what of how we're presenting the information. We have a series of all kinds of short things, you know, when I hate to use this analogy, but a TurboTax light, how do I put together my package that helps me meet all, again, this goes back to automation, but we have just a real complex amount of things to check and to, you know, make sure that it is compliant. And that is really tough. I mean, if you read just the boundary guidance, you know, I've read it numerous times, and it is really, it's tough to make sure that you are compliant with the boundary guidance. And along the lines of the scoping of what requires a FedRAMP authorization, I think we've got to look at the cloud models and figure out a way to, a goal should be to test once, inherit much. And today we do not inherit for our SaaS products, and we would significantly reduce the time and the complexity that's required for SaaS, which is really where we are. FedRAMP is really based, has not evolved as we've moved up the stack. And I think it's time really to test once, inherit much.
All right, thank you, Jackie. Let's move on to considerations. Does anyone have any recommendations of things that we should list under considerations? John, I have you listed first. I'm not sure if your hand was still up, but do you have anything that we should put under considerations?
My hand was still up from earlier. I'm going to lower it. Thank you.
Okay, fair enough. Jackie, also, do you have anything that we should put under considerations?
I just forgot to lower my hand. Thank you.
Fair enough. Mike.
Yeah, sorry, my hand is still up as well for the last section, but I do have things I wanted to add. So just in terms of focusing back on the CSP authorization lifecycle, for each of the phases, we should definitely have a clearly defined SLO for the phase itself, for responses within each of the phases. I think it's very important that we add SLOs and that we actually measure against them as well, so that we could see what the performance is, and where we could have visibility into which phases we need to target, where do we need to add automation, why, and we could also start to deep dive into why it's important for us to, or I'm sorry, why we have hangups, right, or blocks in life cycle. So I think what Jackie just said on the test once inherent munch improvement, if we have a lot more making sure that if we could inherit controls life cycles for these services that we're trying to authorize and for the CSPs and their authorizations, we should also be looking at how do we do that cross-cutting across all of the different programs that are out there. So if there is prior approval in other US government programs, is there a way for us to potentially pull those approvals in for controls? That would be another way we could potentially shorten the life cycle.
I hate to do this to you, Mike, but you did mute for part of your statement. So can I get you to? I know that Clifton, I think, is frantically trying to type in here, but if anything that we missed, just let us know, because we probably had a few seconds of you being muted.
No problem. I'll just try to do it. So defined SLOs for each phase, a measurement of those SLOs and how we're doing against them. And then also just overall response SLOs. So how long does it take from a CSP asking a question to get a response from the government? How long is it taking the government to get information back from CSPs? So we could see if there's actual communication SLO issues where we could potentially find places to automate and reduce that friction point.
Right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Mike. Lamont, do you have anything that we should put under considerations?
Yes, thanks. Lamont, HHS, and what I'm about to say is probably implied or inferred by some of the other items that have been discussed by some of the colleagues here. But I think it should remain top of mind, of course, and I think I heard it said as well that there is a growing demand for cloud service offerings amongst federal agencies. So I think we have to be mindful, and it probably bears noting that we have to be able to manage that increased demand, to avoid those CSP authorization delays.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Lamont. Next, let's go to Marcy.
Thank you, Marcy Womack-Shaman. My only contribution is I think that maybe some of the items and goals can be merged or considered considerations, because I think if we can identify like a few root causes, like some of these are exacerbating issues or other, so they may be more clearly moved into the other category, and just food for thought more than anything.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Let's go to Daniel next.
Hi, it's Daniel Payne, Databricks. I think from my former roles within the federal government, one of the things to consider is there's a fundamental lack of resources across agencies, which does play into who is doing the sponsoring and finding a federal sponsoring agency to work with from a CSP perspective. And then also, kind of in a similar vein, just the FedRAMP understanding and how they interpret different things across the board. So it's it definitely contributes to I think everyone's kind of understanding of the process.
All right, thanks, Daniel. And Mike, do you have something else for considerations? All right, let's move on to the recommendations then.
I'm sorry, I think I was on mute.
Sorry.
No problem. Just the one that I had was around the pace of the threat environment versus the pace of FedRAMP compliance authorizations. So, and specifically around technologies. So like, Google, we're seeing AI being used as a potential new way for new threats to come into the theater. And are we being responsive and fast enough in the US government space to start to be able to combat some of those threats? And is FedRAMP, and is FedRAMP going to be considered a blocker for us to be able to move quickly? Or is it going to be considered something that helps enable the government to respond? Those are things that are really weigh on us, especially from the CSP side of the house. We want to be as responsive as possible.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mike. So we are going to move on to our recommendations piece and spend the rest of the time on that area. So for recommendations, I already have a couple of hands up. All right, let's go back to Mike.
I'm going to put my hand down right now.
Oh, okay, fair enough. How about Branko? How about you?
Yeah, I hate to be that guy, but once again, it is not clear to me, are we making recommendations on the FedRAMP PMO authorization piece or the entire FedRAMP ATO authorization process? And it's really hard to make recommendations without understanding the scope.
So we had a discussion earlier where we would look at the entire, it seems to me that the vast majority of the memberships are interested in making recommendations for the entire scope of the authorization process.
Okay.
Which is a very heroic effort. I agree. But if you want to make specific recommendations just for the FedRAMP piece, I think that would be acceptable. Or if you would like to make general recommendations for the whole authorization aspect, that is also acceptable.
My only concern is that we kicked off with a presentation that was focused on a very narrow scope. And now we expanded our recommendations to something that was not covered in that initial discussion. So we don't fully understand the problem statement there and the problem space. But I'll lower my.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. All right, Robbie, I'll let you.
Yeah, one of the recommendation I have is if FedRAMP PMO can increase their or basically increase their engagement with the CSPs, in the standard body, the first meeting we had, I was mentioning something like ICMC or ICCC in one of those or RSA conferences, if they can interact, create more opportunities for CSP to interact with them, that will be great. Or they can host a couple of days of conference a year or something where CSPs come and interact with them. This will increase the knowledge exchange and will improve the overall process.
All right, thanks, Ravi. I appreciate that. Jim, let's go to you next on your recommendations.
Yeah, this is Jim Beckner with T-Metrics. Definitely want to reiterate what Ravi said and what he said earlier about increasing engagement with CSPs. Totally agree that the PMO, is great at responding to the email box, and I've even had a few people at PMO call me to to clarify things with me, which is great. But definitely increasing the engagement. But to add on to that, to try to maybe minimize the impact on the PMO and increase the speed, at which the CSPs receive information back. Having the process of PMO review seeing if there are ways for it to be a bit more agile than where it is now. I know it takes, it took a few months between package submission and, the first response because the queue was so large. And, I know PMO was dealing with a lot of CSPs that may have some quality issues. And, if there's some way to get pieces of feedback as they go through the process, instead of it just being you wait in queue and then the PMO reviews the entire package at once. If there's any improvements there, that'd be great. If we could, CSPs get back, hey, these control families, here's the feedback on these, we're going to get to the next ones later. Just any way to kind of break it up to kind of keep the process moving as much as possible.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Jim. Marcy, what are your recommendations you would like to include in here?
I have three, I think. One is to consider setting a timeline for achieving agency authorization for a CSP that's in FedRAMP or FedRAMP in process. So oftentimes things that will bloat, in addition to like all the quality issues once you actually get to the PMO, but that bloat that timeline, because in our experience, 7 months is nowhere near accurate, is that agencies take various lengths to actually issue the agency recommendation prior to the package going to the PMO. So if there's a CSP that's FedRAMP in process, that maybe there's some sort of like limit on that agency review process. The second recommendation I have is for the PMO to set a cadence for template and documentation updates. And that would, be inclusive of, updates to control interpretation or control expectation. I know that that's occasionally done with some of the white papers, but again, not all of the documents like SSP, for example, and the white papers or SAR templates, RAR templates, they don't always tick and tie. And so stakeholders, like whether you're a CSP or whether you're a 3PAO, you may be missing a reference. And unless you're doing this day in and day out, maybe 3PAOs who aren't doing a huge number of packages, or you're not a CSP that has been through the process before, it's an unknown. And then last recommendation would be for the PMO to publish on a set cadence, maybe quarterly or semi-annually, the issues that they have seen in achieving FedRAMP authorization. Maybe that's CSPs, not updating the CIS workbook clearly to match their SSP. Maybe that's 3PAO quality concerns around testing of cryptography or FIPS validated encryption. But that type of transparency, I think, is very important because it's a closed loop and it's a cycle, and problems will continue to repeat themselves if they are not made known.
All right, great. Thank you, Marcy. Let's go to Jackie next.
I had a couple of recommendations. One of them is to implement an assessment of the agency processes and authorize agencies in order to bypass that FedRAMP review process to move to marketplace. So this would essentially a maturity model of agency processes that they develop appropriate and quality controlled artifacts so that they get the good housekeeping seal of approval, and they wouldn't need their artifacts looked at. So it's a assessment of the agencies and their processes. I'd also like to make a recommendation to establish a matrix of fully inherited hybrid and mission owner responsibilities for SASs and develop a SAS assessment process. And my last one was to pilot the implementation of OSCAL to determine gaps and improvements to further adoption across the federal government. And that was all I had. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. Let's go to Bo next.
Hey, Michelle. I'm sitting here listening, and I think that, broadly, these recommendations, and frankly speaking, the majority of the discussion fall into three buckets. One, a FedRAMP policy scope bucket, right, in terms of just making sure that we're focused on the right things. Two, really focused around the authorization process, or a bucket specifically associated with that. And then three, some of the sponsorship challenges. And I think those three buckets are fairly, unique, if you will, and should probably be considered within the recommendations to Robin, individually, because they will have themselves their own individual set of recommendations. From a policy, FedRAMP policy standpoint, I do, fundamentally believe that, there is a misnomer in that not everything requires a FedRAMP ATO. And, so just having, that be, reevaluated, I think is necessary. In terms of the sponsorship challenges, I think that really needs to be kind of honed in with its own set of recommendations to really be able to ensure that our vendor partners, our CSPs, whose technologies that we rely on, have an ability to be able to get sponsorships fairly readily, right? And I think that's a challenge that has been stated multiple times over and over again. And then last but not least, in terms of the review process, particularly relative to some of the challenges corresponding to review times, two thoughts. One, not every agency should perhaps be a sponsor, because part of this is, I think, a challenge with the sponsoring agency. And this goes to the point where Jacqueline is talking about, well, can some agencies get a waiver from the FedRAMP review if we know what we're doing? So perhaps the reevaluation of who can effectively be a sponsor or be an authorized sponsor in much the same way as you have an authorized 3PAL. And then the other point is that, is there a possibility that we should be considering to having the FedRAMP PMO outsource some of its work to the agency sponsor and or CSP in combination? So presumably the PMO is reviewing these packages against a checklist. So why not simply have the sponsoring agency and the CSP complete that review against whatever checklist that the FedRAMP PMO uses, and formally attest that, hey, we meet these quality expectations that the PMO has, and set an expectation. If you have these showstopper conditions, don't submit it. It's not going to effectively get through the process, or will effectively go through and result in delay. And something like that is nothing more than a transparent, setting of expectations that simply moves the cheese and effectively ensures that, I think, vendors and agencies and 3PALs know that they have to effectively address, otherwise it will effectively impede the ability to get a FedRAMP authorization and be included in the FedRAMP marketplace in a timely manner. Over.
Great. Thanks, Bo. Let's go to Matt next.
Yeah, this kind of picks up on what I think Bo said earlier, and even just said now. A review and a decision about acceptance of evidence from other test and conformance programs to be accepted by the FedRAMP PMO. And several were mentioned earlier, like ISO or Cloud Security Alliance or SOX or others. So reuse of testing evidence from other programs and a decision about their acceptability. And then back to my drum that I keep beating is that the board advocates for resources being allocated to the FedRAMP program to be able to implement any and all accepted recommendations.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt. Daniel.
Yes, Daniel Payne, Databricks. I would love to see cross-agency sponsorships, similar in a fashion to collaborative Kanban, that could help assist with, getting more sponsorships through. And then two, I would love to see almost like a FedRAMP Sherpa program for agencies who have done this before. They know what they're doing. They kind of have that gold standard. to help other agencies, who maybe don't have the resources or the policies in place to help them get their programs up and running and to make their processes more repeatable.
Right, great, wonderful. Mike.
Yep, I have a couple of, apologies. I put it in the chat just to make it a little easier if it's easy to copy paste. But the first one I had is standardization across reviewers for controls, interpretation, and review. So talking with our industry board for CSPs, there was a lack of consistency on standards and control interpretation, which leads to different levels of fidelity on certain controls. Set and measure SLOs for each of the phases, set and measure SLOs for response windows, definitely going to be needed so that we know where problems are within the process and where we're getting stuck. Review and establish FedRAMP control inheritance from other control programs that are out there and see which ones we could pull in and do an agreement there where we could say we've reviewed this control as a federal government rather than as agency X or FedRAMP Y. And see how much we could get sharing going that will help to reduce time out the gate. The other one, incentivize OSCAL adoption. So I think, to Jackie's point earlier, OSCAL is definitely one of the ways that we want to get out of this. But finding ways to incentivize that is going to be, I think, really important, especially for small to mid-sized business where they don't necessarily have all of the resources to learn OSCAL and to adopt it. So finding ways to do that is going to be important for us as a group. I think we should also figure out all of the automation places for automation. So I know we as the board have a work group here to do that, but I think we probably need to extend that to the FedRAMP team themselves to continue to drive that once we kind of set the high level framing for them. And then making sure that we figure out ways to incentivize adoption of those automation technologies, which should be hopefully relatively simple. And then the last one I had was we really should do a review of the control structure in FedRAMP. A lot of these controls have been in place for many, many, many years. Technology may have changed. We may have better ways of doing things that actually raise the bar, right, and bring us above with the controls we have today state. I just, as a quick example, like, are there new key management technologies that are out there? Is there new ways to separate data logically using encryption that, supersede the need for some of the data residency controls that are in place? It's just one example, but we should really be thinking about how do we continue to maintain and grow the way that we have the maintenance, the control scope, while we continue to reduce the number of controls to make it easier to accredit.
All right, great. And finally, Bill.
Hi, Bill Hunt, SEC. Just wanted to redouble the comments around OSCAL and automation here. A lot of the other recommendations, I think, are really predicated on getting to a higher level of maturity of automating these processes as much as we can. The incentive here, obviously, is that everything gets cheaper and everything goes faster if we can have technology and less humans into the mix overall, which I think is the goal of getting these technologies and cloud stuff in the first place. So I think that we really, really need to double down on that. OSCAL adoption has been so slow. The process has been so slow. We need way, way, way more attention around the automation piece of this than we've been able to give. And doubling down on, I think, what Matt was saying about having the resources necessary to make those tools available and easy to use and into the hands of the vendors immediately. That is the gap here from my perspective, and one of the biggest priorities that we should have.
All right, great. Thank you so much. We are going to move to the trade-off section now. So trade-offs. What are trade-offs that we need to consider? Does anyone have any trade-offs that they'd like to discuss? I see a bunch of people that have their hands up. I think they may have been left up from the last section. So if you aren't interested in talking about trade-offs, please lower your hand. Let's go back to Mike.
I was lowering my hand, sorry.
Sorry. Let's go to Bill then. Bill, if you're speaking, you're on mute. Do you have any trade-offs that you think that we need to consider? All right. Let's go to Bo. Do you have any trade-offs that we need to consider?
I think we all know what a trade-off is. Give one thing to get a little bit of something else. Can you just help us perhaps maybe define exactly what you mean by trade-offs in this context?
Yeah, I think in this context, we're looking at what are some possible items that we can trade off to make some of these items happen, things that we need to consider. For example, potential negative effects to small businesses, that kind of thing. I think unless it's difficult to really identify the trade-offs until we have finalized what our list is. So we could probably skip this section until the November 9th meeting, if that would be more efficient for the team.
Yeah, I did have one recommendation if you would be open to taking it.
Oh, of course.
So, when I think about everything that we're talking about, fundamentally it's focused around ensuring, or unlocking the opportunity for government to use the latest and greatest cloud technology, right? And securely. And, I think one of the challenges that we have not really had a lot on is, understanding the bifurcated security model, in that it takes two to achieve a security outcome, a secure outcome rather. Everything that the provider does as part of their FedRAMP package, and then all of the customer responsibilities that have to be implemented, documented, assessed, and authorized, coupled together with the vendor's authorization package. So those customer responsibilities become really fundamental. It's I think one of the challenges that we have is that those CRM elements, are becoming a bigger and bigger challenge for agencies as part of the leveraged authorization process. And so one recommendation would be, especially as we look at automation, how do we effectively go through and achieve, automation of those customer responsibilities? And, one of the suggestions is, we almost need a mechanism, a reference framework of sorts, kind of like OSCAL, that would allow, cloud service organizations to automatically update their CRMs that then naturally permeates through any and all EGRCs that would naturally subscribe to it, and be able to automatically ingest it. Being able to go through and directly manually update a GRC with all the customer responsibilities for an Amazon, a Microsoft, you go ad nauseum to all of the cloud service providers, is incredibly challenging, taxing, time consuming. And so we need an automation solution for that too.
All right, thanks, Bo. Let's go to our impact to the stakeholders. What are some of the impacts that we would expect to the stakeholders, the CSPs, 3PALs, and the agencies? Does anyone have any suggestions of what we can include here? Lamont, you have your hands raised.
Thanks. I actually had mine with respect to the trade-offs, but I think that Bo made some points that I was going to raise. But with respect to trade-offs, I think from a CSP perspective, I think it would provide the opportunity to offer their products to us, and of course allow them to grow as an organization. From a 3PAL perspective, we can ensure consistent application of existing security practices and controls. And I think the impact to agencies would be the ability to expedite the CSP authorization process and allow agencies to use the desired CSP to meet their mission.
Thanks, that was perfect. Jackie.
Impact to stakeholders from a CSP perspective, I think it is a decrease in expense and faster time to revenue. And I think for small business that is really key if we can achieve the goals. impact to the 3PAO and the agencies is clearer expectations of requirements.
Right. And Marcy?
I would say that the 3PAO expectations also equally apply to CSPs. They're the ones actually implementing the controls. We're just assessing them. So ensuring, and if they know what the requirements are, what they are supposed to do, there are no surprises at the end, then that ultimately feeds all of these goals here.
Great, thanks, Marcy. Matt?
Yeah, call me a little nutty. For the agencies, clearer understanding of risks involved in using a CSP.
All right, great. Any other impact to stakeholders that we need to notate here?
If I could tag on Matt's, we have two perspectives of an agency, and one of them is an agency in the authorization process, and one of them is an agency in the use of a cloud. We call him a mission owner, and I think his is really understanding involved in using the CSP is after authorization. And it is such a valid point, Matt. It's a great point. And having that GRC and allowing inheritance and those types of things, easy access to the body of evidence is probably another impact. But again, that goes to clearer understanding of the risks involved in using a CSP. That is, I just did a cloud brief before this morning, and the major pain point for our authorizing officials is not being able to get to the body of evidence to understand the risks in using a CSP. And so maybe if I went back up to a goal, and whether that's at a different session or not, one goal is to be able to provide those artifacts to the agency, preferably in an automated fashion.
All right, great. Thanks, Jackie. I'm going to go to Bo as the last person to publicly state, but Mike has actually put some of his comments in the chat, so we've highlighted them here in front of you. But Bo, go ahead. Bo, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
Hey, Michelle, sorry about that. And still learning to unmic. So this comes from about point of experience, right? Where Jackie and team, we've facilitated FedRAMP authorizations for roughly 30 providers and working with roughly 13 today. And part of the challenge that I see, I don't know where you want to capture this in the document, is that some cloud service providers are all too happy to effectively get started. And then once we actually engage, they're building the plane as they're flying it. Meaning that we prematurely launch an engagement without a defined, ready, set, go, start, if you will, in terms of, a solution that is largely intact. It's never going to be fully intact, right? Because we are working with an ever-changing environment. But I think that's important to effectively capture, right? Is that, a want and need to effectively get going is a little different than also being ready. And that FedRAMP readiness review, it's supposed to essentially ensure that we actually have a successful path forward. And, there might be a need for us to go through and ensure that that readiness review gets a little bit more permeated throughout the FedRAMP authorization process and not just used directly with the engagement with the FedRAMP PMO itself.
Right, great. Thank you, Bo. I appreciate that. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining this productive discussion that we had today. I think we came up with some really great recommendations and captured some helpful notes to start formulate our final deliverable. As we all know, the next two meetings will be nearly identical in structure to this one, so I look forward to having more discussions then. We are now moving on to the final topic of our agenda with closing remarks and adjournment. I am going to check to see if Anne is available to make any closing remarks. I know that she's been trying to solve her IT issues. Okay, unfortunately, she is still struggling with some of the issues. Thank you all for joining. With that, I will now adjourn the meeting at this time and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.